So welcome everybody, and I want to welcome both the people in the room, presenters and audience, and also those of you who are joining us by live stream. We are really happy to have everybody here to hear some of the wonderful work that our students have been doing in CSSH this year. And people are welcome to come and go as they need. It's not a problem. I do hope that those of you who present will be able to stay and hear some of your colleagues, but I know people have to go to classes or jobs or whatever it is they may need to do. I'm just forgetting whether I actually introduced myself. In case I did not, my name is Laura Green. I'm the Associate Dean for the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for undergraduate education. And again, I'm really thrilled to see you here today. A couple of housekeeping items. I've already explained to the presenters where we need them in the live stream choreography, so that should not be a problem. We will have questions at the end of each panel, so you will hear all the speakers, and then we will ask them to come up again and have questions from the audience, so please keep your questions in mind as your colleagues are speaking. The other thing that I wanted to let you know, there are some beautiful programs at the back of the room. Please take one as a keepsake. Please know, however, that there were some changes to the program, so this is not the most up-to-date and accurate version of the program. That can be found on the Undergraduate Research Forum website, which is on the College of Social Sciences and Humanities website. So please feel free to go there and download one of those as well. We are being recorded, which means that you will be able to re-experience this all over again. So thank you everybody for being here. I am going to now introduce our first moderator, my colleague, Professor KJ Rawson, who is in the Department of English and WGSS and CSGS, or I made that part up? Just English and WGSS. Okay, I always associate you with CSGS as well. Professor Rawson is going to moderate our first panel, so please take it away. And don't trip over this wire, which I almost just did.
Good afternoon. I'm KJ Rawson. I use he, him, his pronouns. Laura already actually did all the housekeeping, so that makes my job a bit easier, so you know what's coming and the structure of that. I'm actually just going to introduce our three speakers for this first panel. I'll introduce all three now, so they can then come up seamlessly as the panel proceeds. So first we will have Peter Burds, who will be speaking. Second, we have Chantel Haigler. And third, we have Jaeyoon Lee. And I'll come back up at the end to have questions all together. Peter?
Hello everybody, my name is Peter Burds. Today I'll just be talking a bit about some work I've been doing as part of an honors interdisciplinary thesis this semester, which takes a comparative approach at philosophical discussions of fate and destiny in pre-Common Era religious and philosophical texts, specifically the foundational Taoist text Zhuangzi, written by an author of the same name about 350 BC, and then the Book of Job from the Old Testament. But today I just want to talk about this book of Zhuangzi, and as you see here, Reconciling Fatalism. That is one of my goals. I feel whenever you talk about fate, it's very easy to say, oh, that's fatalistic. And when you do that, when you just throw out that label, it really misses or deprives you of the abundance of really the profound message that actually is being communicated in these texts. So for those unfamiliar with fatalism, it was described by author and historian Robert C. Solomon as the idea that what happens or has happened in some sense has to or had to happen. Such beliefs seem to involve a peculiar sense of necessity. And then it was kind of broken down even more, somewhat absurdly, to the level by philosophical author Dan Dennett. He said, no agent can do anything about anything. So that kind of does point at the essence of what fatalism is. And we see that the Zhuangzi, this Taoist, the second most important Taoist text, people call it, we see it can be applied to this text very readily when we see passages such as, death and life are destiny. The existence of that which humans can do nothing about is the condition of things. So that's the epitome of fatalism right there. And that's really indeed the view many scholars take on this issue, such as one who kind of crassly put it, that Zhuangzi's this whole way is about cultivating one's slavery character that bears all injustice and muddles along. which is very unfortunate because, as I said, it really just misses, you just throw out that label, fatalistic, and you miss what is actually being discussed here. So, if fatalism is not the way that Zhuangzi does communicate, then what is it? I just want to talk a bit about that. So there are two things you must understand. The first is the idea of multiple destinies. Now, when we think of destiny, we often think of this one thing that you do throughout your life. There's one thing that you're on a path, and then at the end of your life, you are at the end of that path. But this was not just a Taoist idea. This was shared by many other schools during this early time in Chinese history, that there are actually more than one destiny that you can have in your life, such as, this is a quote from the Confucian scholar Mengzi, more commonly known in the Romanization system as Mencius. He said, "One who understands destiny does not stand under a high and dangerous wall. One who exhausts their way and dies has fulfilled their proper destiny. One who perishes in shackles has fulfilled the improper destiny." So right here we see proper destiny, improper destiny. These are two, already a distinction, a branching off. And the real important thing is this first sentence talking about one who understands destiny does not stand under a high and dangerous wall. That means that you shouldn't stand next to a wall that looks like it's about to totter on top of you and kill you, because you shouldn't even put yourself in this situation and say, if I'm going to die, I will die. If not, I will not. But no, he said, don't be stupid. Just step away from the wall. And you have to use your intelligence, because these things aren't guaranteed. There is this proper destiny, this capital D destiny, we can think of it, that you're meant to do. I mean, who would say that the purpose of one's life is to just go, be born, and go through all these good, happy, bad circumstances, meet all these people, and then your destiny is just to have a wall fall on top of you? What kind of universe would that be? So he says that that is an improper destiny which you can choose for yourself. And so that's what Zhuangzi agrees with. So the second thing that you have to consider is the idea of an undefined nature. Now, of course, when you have to look at nature, because, as one scholar said, the nature of things and their fate are inseparable. So to decide how one thing turns out, you have to look at what that thing even is. So Zhuangzi, he thought that we are born and we're inherently blank slates, you can think of it. We're not inherently good or bad, but as Mengzi said, he thought we're born and are inherently inclined to do these morally good things, whereas later on his later contemporary in the same school of Confucianism, Zhuangzi, he said that we're born and inherently inclined to do morally bad things. So Zhuangzi says that no, both of you are wrong. We're born and, well, let me just put it this way. Zhuangzi, or Mengzi, and Zhuangzi, where their two seemingly disparate approaches overlap, is they both agree that ultimately the most important thing is education, how one is raised. The circumstance, that really depends how one's character turns out. But Zhuangzi disagreed. He thinks it's that very education itself, which even culture just gives us the idea in our mind that even things such as good and bad exist. Such as, he thinks it's ridiculous to think we're born and inherently our instinct is to hold the door open for someone. Like, that's just a cultural construction, and you can extend it even farther to all ideas of good and evil. So he thinks, as he describes it, the walking of a path makes it form, the naming of a thing makes it be so. Altogether, if a thing is not complete and not damaged, meaning it's not named as complete, not named as damaged, it returns and passes through the Tao again to become one. So the Tao we can think of as just the meshing of this good and bad. What does it look like? If it's not good and it's not bad, it comes together. What does that look like? Well, that's what he would call the Tao, something in between. And the thing that really makes you fatalistic in life, or this question fate to begin with, is when something bad happens in your life. You say, oh, I have bad fate. But it's times like those, Zhuangzi thinks, that you need to understand that you've fallen on this small d destiny. You're standing next to this high wall, this high tottering wall, and you need to get on this ultimate path of realizing, kind of undoing yourself, undoing your education, not saying you shouldn't go to school. Zhuangzi himself was very educated. It's just this more subconscious education that gives us these ideas that good and bad even exist. Because he says, once you undo those things, then you don't even have any reason to question these things, because you question the bad when it comes up, but then the bad doesn't exist, so what do you have to question? Just go about your life. So that's what Zhuangzi his view really is. And just to summarize it, it's not fatalistic. I think it's best described by this later Taoist idiom, 我命在我不在天, means my destiny lies with myself, does not lie with heaven. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chantel. I use she, they pronouns, and this is the fundamentals of Praxis. So what is Praxis? The world has entered a unyielding racial reckoning, and after the summer of 2020, I think we can all agree that we have collectively wanted to rid ourselves from racism and all systems of oppression, not just racism, but homophobia, sexism, transphobia, etc. And to my knowledge, to my understanding, a world without oppression is called liberation. But also from my experience and the history of liberation movements, what I've seen to make liberation more sustainable, there's a process called praxis. And by definition, the word praxis is putting any theory into practice. So for example, when a musician takes music theory classes and learns scales and chords, and then applies those different scales and chords to create this new improvisation, this new sound, they've come to a musical praxis, a stringing of theory in a way that hasn't been done before. And then they hear this improvisation, they hear that sound and reflect on it, and then they say, oh, well maybe if I use some new theory, a new technique, then maybe I could create a new sound. And that is the cycle of applying praxis. So for me, I wanted to investigate specifically what theories of liberation could I use in my everyday life to live and engage in praxis to liberate myself. How do I get free? And praxis is a living, breathing journey towards this state of justice. So my research question wasn't only how do I engage with liberation, but how do I specifically use theories of liberation that exist to create my own unique Black praxis? So that's a big question. And I created a whole class to do that. And I created syllabus, whole shebang. And there are many dimensions to a human life. And there are many dimensions and many realms in which one can free themselves. So I decided to use Dr. Peggy Swarbrick's 8 Dimensions of Wellness. It was originally created for holistic care for those suffering from chemical dependency. And instead of all 8, there are only 14 weeks in a semester. I chose 4 to really delve and deep dive into how I could liberate those realms of my life. Physical, emotional, occupational, and intellectual. And yeah, because I exist as a Black woman under the social pressures and expectations of Black womanhood, I thought it best to use Black feminist theory, Black feminist theories of liberation. And that includes the work of Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, so on and so forth. So what I did was I took these 4 dimensions, and for each month I delved deeper into it. So for example, for the month of September, this was done in fall 2021, for the month of September, I had a receptive element. So I would read about how Black women are freeing themselves from the horrors of the healthcare system. But I also did some practical element, which was working out every day. That seems more elemental with physical. With something like my occupational life, I focused on both my undergraduate career and my postgraduate career. So I was reading, the questions I tried to answer were, what does liberation look like in my work life? And also what does working towards liberation look like? For me, those happen to overlap. What I want to do with my life just happens to revolve around liberation. So for example, in my undergraduate study, I was reading Jane Kankowski's Deaf Empowerment. My major is American Sign Language and Psychology. And my capstone currently is about the role of BIPOC interpreters and their understanding of their role in the movement towards deaf liberation. Do they think that's something they can be a part of? Should they not be a part of that at all? That's what my capstone is looking at right now. But also in my work life, I work at the Social Impact Lab under Professor Rebecca Riccio, among other places, and I was honored enough to co-author the Principles of Anti-Oppressive Community Engagement for Educators and Researchers. And if you scan that QR code right there, it'll take you to those principles. And what those principles are a communal offering of cultural change at Northeastern. We do a lot of research in CSSH in going into communities, but how do we make sure that that is not a harmful process? It's not enough to just reduce harm, but we have to ensure that, you know, we're engaging communities in this process and making sure it's a full, thriving, healthy experience for everyone involved. So that was the theory of it all. And I found a lot of things out. When you try to unpack your entire life, you learn a lot of things. So I culminated in tradition of Black scholars that came before me. I culminated all those findings in writing. So I created the Fishbowl magazine, soon to be published. And it's a combination of essays and articles, poetry, visual art, in tradition with Black scholarly theory. And it references all of the readings that I was finding, but also my journey in unpacking the many, many systems of oppression that I live under. It was an offering of my life as a way for other people to get a glimpse into my fishbowl, into the very polluted waters that we live in, that are polluted with sexism, racism, homophobia, what have you. And the magazine comes with a accompanying workbook that asks reflective questions. How does homophobia appear in your life? What challenges of masculinity are you challenging yourself to unpack? Because when we unpack our own, when we clean up our own fishbowls, it's a lot easier to have a cleaner ocean between us all. And that's the point of collective liberation. And during this process, I recorded all of it. I am a film production minor. I'm in a documentary production class right now, and the final for that class will be me culminating this entire journey. People think that this seems very theoretical and heavy, but it applies to a human life. And unpacking all of this applies to my human life, so I recorded that human experience, that human journey, and we'll be releasing it to the world in the form of a documentary. So what's next? If you take away nothing from this, individual lives are permanently shaped by the systemic oppressions that you perpetuate. So it's not too far a jump, even though it feels too far a jump, it's not too far a jump to say that the transphobia or the homophobia that you participate in is also directly connected to some individual's oppression. And that's the experiences that people are bringing into their classrooms, into whatever space they occupy. As a queer woman, as a trans non-binary individual, these are some of the things that when we share spaces like classrooms and so on and so forth, these are the things that we're asking people to unpack and give of themselves, when really it shouldn't be the job of the oppressed, it's the job of everyone. So what's next? An official release of the magazine with the documentary in late July. And I would like to continue this work. I am a senior, I'm a graduating senior. So I want to continue this work at NYU's Gallatin School of Independent Study, where I can collect this work on an aggregate level. So this is just my individual fishbowl of my life. I want to know what the ocean looks like. How are Black women specifically finding their own routes to liberation? Is it through social media posts? Is it in community? Is it through books the way it was and pamphlets the way it was way back when? So that's what I would like to study. And then I haven't even released volume 1, but volume 2, I would like it to be an oral collection. In this process, it's created a lot of community and a lot of collective liberation amongst my friends, my tribe, my people, and that's continuing to spread. And in that process, we've just shared a lot of stories, and those deserve to be recorded and preserved, which is what volume 2 would be about. And that is the fundamentals of Praxis.
Just use a podium right here if that's okay for everyone. Hello, thank you for coming to my presentation. It's called Training in the Art of Medicine, Applications of Narrative Medicine to Residency Programs. This is as part of my capstone project and the Health Initiatives program. This project initially started in response to the growing concerns about healthcare, particularly about the relationship between the patient and the physician. As we all know, tremendous progress has been made in medicine and science, and there's ways we can diagnose disease more than ever before. But with that said, there is a growing concern in physicians and how they connect to patients in ways which we kind of leave them more to be left desired. I think this is a good kind of transition from the second point of there is racism, there is transphobia in terms of what healthcare has yet to provide for. And basically why I say this is, in short, doctors often lack the capacity and skills to work for the patient's well-being. And in response, much work has been done to study and mitigate this deepening disconnect between the doctor and the patient. This presentation right here, and my research concerns specifically about narrative medicine, which is a contemporary model to rehumanize medicine, if you will. So I want to begin is saying, what is exactly narrative medicine? One way to kind of understand it is that it's a discipline or a model incorporating narrative competence and features of literary analysis to recognize, absorb, and interpret the stories of illness a patient brings. So as a physician, that means to practice narrative medicine is to understand that there are personal evidence and experience of a patient can, and most importantly, should be incorporated into evidence-based practice. It's more than just diagnosis. It's what the person brings when they're in a clinical setting, their culture, their philosophy, their background, their identities, and that should not be ignored. Here, so the idea here is through the diagram is that narrative competence provided through the practice can help mitigate the critical concern between the disconnect of the patient and a physician and bridge the gap between them and what you consider the science and the art of medicine. The major principles of narrative medicine, at least for what this study concerns, has been pioneered by Dr. Rita Sharon from Columbia University. And she's both a physician and a literary scholar, and a lot of her work has been based on the fact that medical practice should be structured around the patient's narrative. Now, this takes a prominent role, and it has gained a lot of traction, especially during the pandemic, and here we are now. It's been gaining a lot of interest, and so it has a prominent role now in medical education, especially for medical universities. However, despite its promising outlook, and I'm biased towards this because I like stories in medicine, kind of like that, so its impact and significance is still not known, especially in the graduate level. And while much of its attention has been placed in medical schools as theories to learn for students, or in clinical practice, such as attending physicians to be realized, its role in residency, which is a critical stage of development for students to become actual doctors, has yet to be explored. So here I'm presenting basically what you consider a literature review to analyze the impact of narrative medicine implemented and studied in residency programs so far. As a biology and English major, I was always interested in stories and how stories connect to medicine and health. So I was always curious about what the nature of health was in context to stories. So this project was a unique experience to see basically the current perspective and the landscape of what stories are in both the medical field and the path of becoming what you consider the good doctor, which is a term that often has ancient roots in Greek, because that's how it first started. So kind of beginning with all this is that the overview of narrative medicine and how it's implemented, I had to begin with identifying key articles. I kind of put on the screen right there the key criteria, which kind of includes basically what are the specific studies implemented in programs. And the exclusion criteria, which is a lot more, is basically a lot of theories and publications, and basically on both the medical school aspect, which is more pedagogical, and also clinical setting, which is basically doctors having their op-ed or editors saying, this is what narrative medicine is and how to apply it. So kind of stifling through all that, I was able to get 56 that looked potentially good and keep screening through it. I ended up with 7, but that's okay.
It's research.
Mm-hmm. In the end, for these 7, there were notably from internal medicine, OBGYN, neurology, and psychiatry. There is one surgical, but I kind of want to get that right there. It's a specific section that I wanted to talk more about. And basically, the main form of how they incorporated narrative medicine is basically via workshops, which is more on the principle of narrative medicine, and reflective writing, which I believe they try to do it in terms of practice. Can you practice narrative medicine? And this form of implementation basically complements the demanding schedule for a residency, which has been a huge part or argument of how to incorporate it. And because residents have on-calls, conferences, and countless overnight shifts, so a large portion of consideration that these people made is based on feasibility. Can we demand more from these people who have so much already? My next thing was basically what did they measure? and although there's been slight variation, the general trend has been based on the three right there, which is perceived competence, residential well-being, and interest. Now, the first two have been based on surveys, which is perceived competence. What do you gain out of narrative medicine? What do you grow? What do you get good at? And a lot of them is based on the general mainstream belief of what humanities is for. Communication, empathy, all this kind of professionalism, all those kind of general aspects of what they think you should learn in, but can't really learn in medicine, is what they think humanities should do. And thus, a lot of the projects of what they study is based on those kind of competence. And what they did was surveys, like a Likert survey, which is how general comfortable you feel now, or how have you felt like you've grown in after the trials. And the second one was, what I found interesting, was a subject of how did the residents feel about these. The OBGYN study kind of recorded, can narrative medicine help with burnout rates or emotional exhaustion? And they did a lot of like studying and focus on how the residents felt through the workshops and after the reflective exercises. And that all kind of correlates to the third one, which is interest. How interested were the residents in this kind of program? They're studying medicine, but can this like also complement what they study in terms of science? Well, they kind of use attendance record to kind of indicate, are they interested in this? Is this feasible? And do they like this? To which the same OBGYN study kind of showed different residents with different attendance record and try to correlate how they felt. If more people went to these workshops and they had better like emotional outcome, then they would kind of go, yes, they were both interested in it, enthusiastic about it. They were also very helpful. But kind of the question goes with correlation is not causation. Are these people emotionally available and that's why they're able to be there, or because this is helpful, they were like more emotionally available? It's still up there for the air and we don't really know. And that's why this is a literature review, to kind of bring that into light. And finally, the third thing I kind of focused on, or the second thing out of that was, if that's the case, if this is what narrative medicine has been incorporated, which is basically reflective writing, can I not just say writing makes better doctors than the whole field of discipline? Into which this was a study of isolated reflective writing, which has been in like kind of like the mainstream, like the dialogue a lot longer, because there's a fascinating niche between writing and physicians and basically medicine. And surprisingly, there were mixed results in terms of, does writing help residents become better? Yes and no. It depends. Yes, if the residents are caring about it. No, if they just do this because they've been called to do this. There has been several research based on like anesthesiology residents where reflective writing did not do anything to make them better. And I want to kind of suggest that this is because there's a lack of frame or a model to understand your experience with. You can't just ask someone to reflect on it and kind of leave it off that, but rather you need a model, you need a framework to better understand what happened and how to best go forward with it, which is basically what you consider narrative insight and experiences. And finally, my last point of the research has been based on surgical residency, and this is how my first research started. I had a co-op experience where I worked at an orthopedic clinic, and a lot of my experience there was basically shadowing surgeons and basically watching them operate, do clinics, and kind of handle different aspects of what it meant to be a doctor, and I was very fascinated by it. And naturally for me, it was like, what are the ways in which skills demanded by a surgeon? Because at the moment I saw them be in clinic and also chop a knee off. So for me to see that, I asked that question, and how does what I'm interested in, which is literature, play a part in that? There were basically no studies based on this. They didn't even care about narrative medicine. But there is one key study that did show, okay, we tried narrative medicine, and this is what happened. And this is in contingent with the idea of technical versus non-technical aspect of surgery. There has been a lot more dialogue lately in terms of the surgical field that we need to help cultivate non-technical aspects of surgeons, which is communication, empathy, leadership, management, honesty, and because most of the mistakes happening are based on those traits more than a scalpel. And in kind of contingent with that, the idea of what this research found was basically about how they can learn these competencies beyond the technical aspect was something that I found really interesting. Basically, for time-wise, I think one of the conclusions to make out of these is basically it was surveys. A lot of these, for better or for worse, these were based on surveys. And one of the dangerous assumptions of these surveys is that they were perceptions. They were perceived by residents and how comfortable they felt. One aspect is that reliable? And this is not new topic because the idea of how do you measure humanities has always been an issue, especially in medicine, where it's an empiricism-driven field with data, numbers, and figures. The other one that I thought was a dangerous assumption made was basically about, is humanities what you make of it? It's really not, but to make it a survey of saying, okay, because they felt like they got better is a dangerous assumption to which this research poses a question of how can we measure competence in terms of residents, and second, how can we keep them accountable? Because there is a way where they have to grow and be wrong and learn from that mistake. The second one is these were residents and not patients, to which this whole model is about patient-centered model, and if the patients have not felt the impact of these narrative medicine, is it a point? Is there use to it? To which the question there is about how can the patients feel the significance of this narrative medicine, and in what ways can we measure that? Kind of in conclusion to that, this has been a great experience to kind of see what the landscape is about in terms of stories and how stories play out in medicine. And most importantly, it was about, I believe in the power of stories. I think that's kind of obvious to say, but specifically this research has allowed me to see more of the visibility of stories in terms of can we see the stories play out? Can we kind of, I think one of the crucial terms is to neither deny a person a story or make more of it than what it actually is, because that both denies the person of their personhood. And I think this is kind of the way to go for it. And this has been a great experience. So thank you.
All right, so we can have the three panelists come back up. That would be lovely. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to help to facilitate that process. So does anyone have a question they want to get us started with?
So those were three wonderful papers, thank you. And Chantel, can I direct you to the other side of the screen so that you guys are flanking the screen? That's lovely, thank you. That was not my question. I am with my colleagues, you know, we try to put these panels together in some kind of thematic way, given everybody's conflicting schedules and so forth. And I never know how that's going to work. And then when I hear the papers, I'm like, wow, we are so clever, because these papers I thought spoke to each other in fascinating ways. For one thing, to use the term provided by Jaeyoon, they're all in some way about narrative, right? But not, they're all really about the stories that we tell about lives. And I love that. And we have these different scales, right? We have the individual, like really focusing on the individual life. We have the kind of sort of all human lives, right? And then a kind of population under certain conditions. But so I have so many connections I'd like to ask you about, but the one, maybe others will take up others. The one I wanted to focus on was I was trying to think about the connection between Chantel's and Peter's papers, which is to say between praxis as a concept, right? Which is a kind of concept of making, right? Theories out there, but I'm going to embody it and make a narrative. And fate, right, or destiny, because that is also, and I love the story about the wall, but you know, how you approach the concept of destiny is also about, am I going to kind of make my story, or am I going to stand here and wait for the wall to fall on me, right? Which is, so I just wondered, this is a very open-ended question, but whether either or both of you would like to say a little bit more, sort of having heard all the papers, about how you see your topic, praxis or destiny, Tao, as telling a story about human life. Actually, all three of them. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, I definitely think there's part of it. Of course, I talked against the idea of fatalism, so I believe that there is this action you have to take. And there's a common misconception about Taoism that it's the philosophy of non-action, which is due to a mistranslation of the concept of wu wei, which that's kind of how it translates. But it's more acting out of like spontaneity, or like just kind of following your life, just making what you want of it, basically. It's not, I don't know, it's hard to say how much they would think of the individual personality, because in the end it's all about dissolving yourself in the one great force. So I don't know how much they would really emphasize like individual personality, but I don't know. I think that definitely the concepts can be applied to in an innumerable number of ways to every aspect of life, and that's one of the things I personally find interesting about Taoism.
Yeah, I wonder how, Chantel, I mean, do you think Praxis and Taoism then, as Peter's describing it, are opposed, or can you see, no?
Well, first, I'm a queer black woman. The wall's going to fall on me regardless. So I think, from my very limited understanding of Taoism, I think, so in Taoism there isn't the consideration of the individual, but there is in liberation the consideration of the collective. So if the wall is to fall on each and every one of us, it is our jobs to take the bricks and make something of them, which is kind of the reduction, the taking out of fatalism and making something out of this coming together, this meshing that you were talking about, and that meshing, just from a Praxis perspective, is liberation.
Can I ask the question one more time?
Can I ask the question one more time? Maybe so. Why don't we wait and see if someone else has a question, and then I can come back to it. I know there's questions.
Yes. Through all, I also sense this discomfort that we have with our own stories and other people's stories and needing to hold them and be responsible for them. And what does that mean? What does it mean to confront the issue of our fate or whatever we're going to call it? What does it mean to be responsible as a doctor to care for somebody in the context of their story? And why is it so hard to get to the roots of our own story that, it involves this? And so what's going on with that?
I feel like, the research minded was a critical concern of doctors and their relationship with their patients, which is both a story of what does it mean to be a doctor, as well as what does it mean to be a patient, to be there with the risk of being unrecognized or unheard. And I think this focus was basically about the less we can focus on the story of a doctor and how that plays, the more we can actually value and recognize the story of a patient. And I feel like in the context of us all together, it does mean about Black women, it does mean about gay people, and all of that being playing together, I think, plays a large part in what I feel of concluding my own research is what does it mean to be a doctor, and anything imagined make it less of that. And ultimately, the demand of a doctor is pretty vague and something of like, what can you do as a doctor? To which the more you kind of limit that and say you're not God, you're just a person there, the more I feel like it allows room to make a space for, let's say, the healthcare of nurses or PAs or even patients themselves. So the interference of stories is what I would kind of suggest in a concrete answer for that difficulty. So.
Chantel, did you want to add on to that?
So you mentioned in your presentation the issue with the lack of a framework. And you just mentioned just now how the definition of doctor is quite vague. And I think to answer your question, it's about why it's so hard to get to the root of these issues is because there is no framework, and the frameworks we do have, we don't acknowledge or don't recognize. It's when we don't acknowledge or recognize a lived experience or a narrative as a framework, as something to look through, that we don't, that we have the problems we have getting to the roots of the issues that we see. So I think it's first the finding a framework that works, whether it be praxis or narrative medicine or whatever it is, but also recognizing the frameworks that exist in the human story already.
I have a question. And this may be completely off because it's really related to the comments you all just made. Because when we think about individuals' experiences, and then we also think about the power of collective, there's a balancing act that goes on there, right? Because the moment you start to talk about the individual, you could potentially create a hierarchy. And in creating that hierarchy, that actually dissolves the collective. So where do you see that potential challenge being maybe mitigated? And this is just maybe just off on a tangent, really related to all of your presentations. But I would say, look, some of the questions that we even asked are related so much to the fact that individualism has become so central to our discussions. But in fact, by doing so, you've actually eliminated the balance or the need in society for the collective. So just a any comments that you might have.
No, I really understand that. I appreciate that comment because I think I grew up in Korea, which means a lot more of Eastern tradition of I bow to my grandma automatically. It's kind of like the idea of hierarchy and institutional loyalty, or that kind of respect has always been like familiar, in which kind of growing up in high school in Texas, which is about individualism, has been there's a lot of, if not conflict, but confusion most likely. And I think out of that, I'm still having trouble with that conflict balance, if you will. And I think the best question for me is, like, I ask myself in terms of kind of navigating that space has always been, well, what does a society mean to a person? Like, instead of vice versa, of what does a person mean to society, to which individual might say, well, that doesn't matter. And I kind of asked that because the way in which I understood what history and culture meant to me, which is a lot more a collective understanding, is pretty significant compared to a friend I would have, which is about the way they understood their college experience has been more of me isolated and an individual with close friends, if you will. And that doesn't really like answer any question, but it definitely is a starting point for which I kind of had to navigate that space.
Yeah. For me, it's a reframing or redefinition of individual. It sounds contradictory, but in collective cultures or just in different spaces, like the individual includes a we, and it really does it eliminates that tension a little bit when you think of yourself, when you think of individual, and it automatically includes we. It's not an erasing of yourself and your characteristics of self. It doesn't erase the self at all, but it's an expansion of what self means. And that includes the collective. And that can be done in such small and seemingly elemental ways. So, for example, Bell Hooks, before she passed, would write her signature on her books would be lowercase. It would be lowercase b and a lowercase h for the sake of why should she capitalize herself, her name, herself. And that was in recognition of the tension between individual and collective, because her individual self, while it was still very present and very profound and impactful in all of her work, she still understood that her self was part of a we, and that shouldn't have been prioritized or capitalized, even in something as simple as printing and literature.
Yeah, and I think in Taoism there's this idea that, well, it's implied that the individual and this hierarchy or the community are kind of disparate, but there's this idea, which is also a rhetorical concept, where you name one thing and it creates its opposite just by, well, if you say something's beautiful, then automatically ugly is created because you're choosing not to talk about that. So therefore everything kind of interconnected like that, and as they have been talking about, I think, yes, the individual and the community are both, there's a way, it might not be tangibly graspable very readily, but it is, there is this gray area where, or a golden area, I guess, since that's what you're going for, that's what you should always strive for.
And that is a perfect note to end on. So please join me in thanking our panelists again.
And please also thank our wonderful moderator. And I hope some of you will be able to stay, but anyone who needs to go at any time should feel free to do so. I'm just going to introduce the moderator for our second panel. Thank you again. So it is, grabbing the program here, my great pleasure to introduce the second of today and last of the this year's Undergraduate Research Forum panel, which is going to be moderated by Madhavi Venkatesan, who is an assistant teaching professor in economics and who has just done a wonderful job in mentoring so many economics projects. So we are delighted to have her with us today. And I think you probably got the lie of the land of what the moderator job is. So I'm going to invite you to the podium to introduce our final panel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to have a panel of 3 speaking groups. The first group being a solo, and it's Tabor Skiba, and he's going to talk to us about the value of water. Thank you.
So my project is titled The Value of Water, and I was looking at, it stemmed from, I had done some survey work in regards to people's perceptions of water, and so this project, the basis of it is how does our perceptions of water impact the value, and then the problems that creates and potential ways to solve that primarily through pricing mechanisms. So it begins with the historical perception of water, and this is in like a United States context. Historically, so there's a paradox of value when it comes to water. This is outlined by Adam Smith. This is like a classic example. Water is perceived as very abundant, and because of its abundance, it has no value. If you look at something like a diamond, it has a perceived scarcity, so that's where its value comes from. But water is essential for life, and yet it still does not have that value attached to it. So when you look at the historical context and historical treatments of water in colonial America, for example, you've got the cultural habits that sort of carry over from England. People, for the most part, did not drink just straight water. In England, it was not very accessible, and there was this idea that disease was in it, and these sort of tastes carry over. People drank fermented beverages, because the fermenting process was believed to remove disease, and there was just a larger culture regarding consumption of alcohol. And so now you've got a culture that does not consume drinking water, which automatically is going to have some effect on its perceived value. And then another primary use of water is sanitation. And when it comes to sanitation, again, it's sort of this cultural habits that have carried over. There's a lot of labor costs associated with bathing, etc., because for the average person, you had to transport water to your household to bathe. And it was very commonplace for access to water within cities to be very contaminated. It was definitely seen as acceptable for people to, you would dump your waste in the street. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, all these businesses that produced tons of byproduct would be built on rivers and emptied into the river. And, because of this perceived abundance of water, this is acceptable, right? It's like the river can tolerate this waste because there's so much, but quickly becomes polluted. And that's just sort of illustrative of a general trend of how we treat natural resources that we perceive there to be a lot of, as you sort of push the costs down the line. But now we're running into a point where it's time to pay, and the regeneration rate of these resources is really uncertain in that question. So then, given this context so now you've got this historical precedent where I would say the two most prevalent uses of water, which are hygiene and consumption, aren't very commonplace, which is going to impact your overall perception of water, right? So that combined with this perceived endless abundance of it takes us to pricing. So there's this conflict where we perceive access to water as a right, which means you should not be limited in your access to it, right? And that it should be free and available to all. But also, then you very quickly get into this tragedy of commons, where if we all get to consume as much water as we want, or even if we just all get to consume water with no cost, very quickly, we impact water resources. So then my research began to look at economic tools that would reduce consumption, but also have effects on perception and change people's habits, change price elasticity of demand, and we want to have people perceive water as something that is valuable and finite, right, is the end goal, because historically we've ended up here because we perceive water as, limitless and free, essentially. So then I began to look at various existing price structures, and what is quickly clear is when it comes to any sort of like flat rate, you're not really going to impact people's consumption. So if you pay some fixed amount for water monthly, yearly, etc., you really don't perceive any drop of water to cost more than the next, etc. And your habits aren't going to be curbed, right? And this is definitely people are billed per amount, but especially, if you rent, etc., like your price is very fixed for certain amounts of time, right? Which is going to make you not responsive to price changes, especially rent, etc. So then another thing is I looked at like the discount rate as another economic tool we use to measure the value, of future assets, etc. And if you're looking at, when it comes to natural resources, the idea is you want to pair the rate of it, the value of it in the future with how much it's going to regenerate. And historically, water, we get this idea that water is limitless, so we don't worry about the regeneration rate. But obviously, water covers 70% of the Earth's surface, but only 1% of water in the world is potable and drinking. And we can't say for certainty that that amount is shrinking, but we certainly can't say it's growing. There's a lot of uncertainty, and currently the discount rate of the resource doesn't reflect that. So you begin to look at, what I'm currently looking at is, do we want a zero discount rate? Do you want a negative discount rate? So it's, the pricing part is using economic tools, yes, to look at water consumption and how we can affect it, but also what economic tools have failed us or have put into place this idea that water is constantly regenerating, like the discount rate is commonly used with money, etc. Like, have we misappropriated these assumptions from other economic examples to natural resources? And so one of the questions is, if it's hard to measure people's responsiveness to price changes, this is especially more in a residential context I was looking at. It's hard to measure people's responsiveness, and price changes can be delayed through rent, etc., right? Or even, delivery methods. People can just take less profit margins at first before passing that cost on. Why wouldn't we just do quantity restriction? You allocate X amount for some family, etc. Like per household size, you get however many gallons. And the thing is, this is sort of how we already do it in places where there's droughts, etc., and people still don't really change their behavior. Your behavior only changes, the evidence shows your behavior only changes as long as that regulation goes on, and regulation changes with elections and etc. That's just the nature of it. So if you can consume more in the next period, the next regulation change, you will run up against that. And now that we've established the perception as a problem, this quantity restriction is not going to change your fundamental understanding of the value of natural resources, right? So it's not sustainable. And so then this is just the beginning of some empirical exercise, the scope of which might be too grand for me to undertake, but to just sort of look at what is a reasonable amount where we would want the price to begin to increase. Like, you would want to charge a certain amount for people's necessities, like the water they would need to cook, bathe, at a reasonable level, right? And then once you start to get into excess water usage, pools, watering some giant lawn, you would want the marginal price to increase from there. So this is just, a baseline trying to estimate what the average household member would use, which would be 46 gallons. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty in what is actually needed. So then, just sort of looking to next steps, again, there's this dilemma of water is a right. So when you start to price things, you don't want to price people out of rights, natural resources, etc. So perhaps any sort of pricing mechanism that would exist going forward some degree of price discrimination might be useful. If you've got a lower income household, they could receive water at a discounted rate, but still have increasing price that would hopefully still curb excess consumption. And in terms of policy, my research has been looking more specifically at residential use. So there's certainly going to be some high volume consumers who are willing to pay for price increases, especially like we're implementing a marginal price, right? There's going to be some wealthy people with, you think of like the largest residential uses for water, their lawns and swimming pools. People who have massive lawns and large swimming pools are going to be less sensitive to price changes. So that suggests you'd want some sort of hard cap, and that would be sort of a traditional quantity restriction. And also more empirical work would sort of be needed to determine what you want that hard cap to be, right? Like if you determine the base needs of a household, would you want the hard cap to be 4 times the base needs, but that seems to be underexplored in the literature. So yeah, that's pretty much the next steps. Is just sort of outlining a basic pricing model of based on, what a household needs, some increasing price rate up, and also looking at obstacles to that, like for renting, for example, as a renter, you're not subject to month price changes, in your utilities, etc., if that's included in the rent. But this is interesting because cost savings here incentivize property owners to switch to like low flow shower heads and toilets, and those can save, in 1 year, they can more or less pay for their installation, So that's an avenue where perhaps customers who are not sensitive to price changes like renters, etc., can be impacted by increasing prices of water. And that's pretty much my presentation.
Thank you very much, Tabor.
So this
And we will, I just want to throw them on the, we will hold questions to the end of the panel, and then there will be time for questions of all the panelists.
It's my pleasure to introduce Katherine von Woert, Katelyn Buckley, Jonathan Barron, Sophia Olivieri, forgive me if I've said it incorrectly, and Pamela Lalli. I had the privy of being able to say Tabor's name correctly because he's working with me. So, please.
Hi, so unfortunately, some of our collaborators couldn't be with us today, but our research project is cycling cities, measuring transportation access and equity in the Boston BlueBikes Bikeshare system. So we did this in collaboration with our, former professor, Timothy Frazier. Thanks. Do I just Oops. Okay. So some context for our presentation background. So active transportation is human-powered transportation, so walking, cycling, maybe scootering. I've seen a lot of people doing that lately. So really anything that's not like a car, a bus, train. So obviously this has been shown to have positive health impacts because you're getting your heart rate up, kind of getting some movement in your everyday. And cities are really trying to partner with other companies to really increase this because it's good for the environment, but it's also good for their citizens. So some ways that this has been done is through urban planning policy initiatives to really promote biking. So they'll add like bike racks, they'll increase the width of sidewalks. Something that was modeled, they modeled different cities, and they found that protected bike lanes, when they have those little white poles sticking out of the street, those have been very effective in decreasing accidents. And then they also saw that in Boston, the most biking accidents were due to speeding, so regulations like that. And then we were motivated to kind of look into this because climate change is an issue, so cities are increasingly adopting strategies to partner with these bike share programs like City Bikes in New York City, and obviously BlueBikes, to promote these low carbon transport options. Some other motivations, interesting things that have been happening with the pandemic. There was some changes with biking, but that was largely depending on where you were, what the outbreaks, the restrictions were. And then also kind of seeing that the rates of biking really do depend on who is biking. So there's going to be more biking during the week than the weekend because people are trying to go to work, places like that. People, you can subscribe to these programs. Subscribers are obviously going to use the bikes more than just one-time users. But really our goal was to kind of look at all of that and then evaluate the equity of the BlueBikes bike share program. We descriptively evaluated which types of neighborhoods use BlueBikes more and how those rates have changed over time. And then we hypothesized that ridership levels are far lower between neighborhoods of color than in white neighborhoods, and also that ridership levels are going to be much greater in wealthier neighborhoods than in working class neighborhoods.
All right, so We sought to determine how the demographic characteristics of Boston neighborhoods are linked to blue bike activity. And the way we did this was with the BlueBikes dataset. BlueBikes, through its public partnership with the city, is required to publish all of its data for public use. It is over a decade's worth of data set, starting in 2011. We have every ride taken since then. It is millions of observations, and it is awesome. We cross-referenced all of this data, the start and end, where they were, when it happened, how long it took, etc. We cross-referenced it with the Boston census data. And in this way, we hoped to gain an idea of the demographics of who is using these bikes, where they are coming from, and where they are going. Unfortunately, we don't have data on the individuals who took these trips, or maybe fortunately, I wouldn't want it logging my social security number every time I hopped on a bike. So we hoped to substitute that individual data with aggregate data from the Boston census. We looked at several variables of interest. Our two primary independent variables were race and class. Race was measured as the percentage of people in a particular census block that were non-white, and class was measured as the percentage of the population, or of the households rather, in a census block that is making more than $60,000 a year, which is as close as we could get to median income with the granularity of the data we were provided. We analyzed the statistics of each variable and found the values with which to compare. And this is what our data looks like. The gist of it is that there are alarming inequalities in the demographics of who is using these blue bikes. We believe in the merits of the BlueBikes program. We believe that greater ridership and greater, more widespread adoption would be a benefit to the city and everyone in it. And we believe that in order to realize that full potential, it needs to be for everyone. And the data show at this time, it does not appear to be that way. So, we have in this square the percentage of trips that started and ended in a given neighborhood based on its percentage of its residents which are non-white. So along the x-axis we have the source neighborhood if you are starting the trip from a non-white neighborhood, and on the y-axis we have the destination neighborhood if you are ending the trip in a non-white neighborhood. We can see the vast majority of the data lies in the bottom left quadrant, indicating that it is mostly white people who are taking these trips, and they are traveling to and from mostly white neighborhoods. Likewise, on the right here we have the graph of the income levels of the start and end neighborhoods. You can see it's clearly in the top right, indicating that it is mostly wealthy neighborhoods which are both the source and destination.
So kind of just concluding and some extensions, we did find that there were stark inequalities in BlueBikes usage, but it is important to note that it did slightly change over time. Pretty slightly, but they still change, so there's some positive movement, which is good. But then also, really, in order to increase the accessibility of BlueBikes, it's really just we need to make sure that there are more stations in these communities that haven't been using them as much, but also kind of policy in a way that makes using a car or taking the train less desirable, and people are really incentivized to bike, where whether or not that's convenience or cost, things like that could definitely make a big impact.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have our final group. This will be Kayla Collins, Ravi Shah, excuse me. It's hard to see. I don't wear carrying my glasses for the sake of carrying a smaller purse, and I definitely need to be carrying them on my neck, I think, so forgive me for that. And then you have another member.
Yeah, we were actually able to have another member join us, so this is Sanjana.
Would you like to tell me your name, please?
Sanjana?
Sanjana?
Yeah. Patel.
Patel.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure you all get appropriate podium time. So thank you. And the slide advances right here on the podium. Thank you.
Hi everyone. We're all members of the Linguistics and Law Lab here at Northeastern, and we are currently working on our California Jury Instruction Project, which is a psycholinguistic study where we're exploring the question, are defendants in California treated fairly?
To begin to understand why we're asking this question, we need a little bit of the background. In 2003, California deleted 3 crucial words from its jury instructions, and the words were each element of. The previous version of the instructions clearly explained that in order to find a defendant guilty of a crime, they must be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of each element of the crime. Without the words each element of, there will be only a holistic approach of the crime, thus jurors will be tempted to vote guilty. After the new instructions, the ones without the language each element of, the number of guilty verdicts increased according to attorneys in California. One of these attorneys, Mark Yanis, reached out to us about conducting this study. We hypothesized that deleting the 3 words, each element of, caused the increase in guilty verdicts. Without those words, we think that some jurors will be tempted to incorrectly find a defendant guilty based on just a majority of elements. Now our lab will test both versions to find out.
So in order to test our hypothesis and the effect of removing those 3 words, we ran a pilot study where half of the respondents received the each element of instructions and half received control instructions where that language was not included. And we tested our hypothesis using a kidnapping crime scenario where respondents read the following. You be the juror. Imagine that you're a juror in a criminal case. Read the facts of the case, then the instructions on how to reach your verdict, and finally answer a set of questions. The facts. The defendant is charged with kidnapping in order to molest a child. At the trial, the evidence shows that the defendant approached a 10-year-old boy standing next to the slide at a local playground and offered to take him to his apartment to play video games. The child agreed, but before they could go anywhere, a nearby police officer walked over and arrested the defendant. At the trial, the jury sees a video of the incident. They hear the defendant's friend testify that the defendant had been planning to entice the boy to his apartment to molest him. A defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires that the prosecution prove a defendant guilty of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced that the charge is true. To decide whether the prosecution has proved the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, you must consider all the evidence.
And then after that, you were able to either receive the each element section or the control section. So our each element was our treatment in this scenario, and they read the instructions that are on the screen here. For the crime of kidnapping in order to molest a child, the prosecution must prove each of the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. 1, the defendant persuaded a child younger than 14 years old to go somewhere. 2, the defendant did so in order to molest the child. And 3, as a result of the defendant's conduct, the child moved a substantial distance. Now, 2 of these 3 elements are the ones that are satisfied. 1 is satisfied by the facts, so is 2. 3 is not satisfied, as in this sentence you can see that before they went anywhere, a nearby police officer arrested the defendant. So then the last line of these instructions reads, if the evidence does not prove the defendant guilty of each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. So you see each element here, 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 and here again. And that's the model that we are testing.
The control represents what the current instructions are in California, And you can see that it's practically the same, but the difference is that it lacks the words each element of in both the facts and in the instructions, and that's what's crossed out in orange. And the last line reads, if the evidence does not prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. So it's just eliminating the 3 words, each element.
And after respondents read the facts and the instructions, they were asked to answer 4 questions. So first, they chose a verdict of guilty or not guilty. Next, they were asked to explain their reasoning. Third, they were asked to check which elements they believe the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And 4, they were given the alternate version of the instructions and asked whether their verdict would have changed had they received those.
So these were our results from our pilot study, which we ran with, I think it was around 27 participants, right? So first I'm going to direct your attention to figure 1A, which is this middle figure right here. And in this, you can see that the each element group did have a lower rate of guilty verdicts than the control group, meaning that it does align with our hypothesis that you are more likely to pick a guilty verdict if you were able to take a holistic approach because each element is not specified in the instructions. This is 13% versus 33%. This is almost 3 times the rate of choosing guilty. But why were there any guilty verdicts in the each element group at all? Our second question, as Kayla said, was to check off each element that you think was satisfied by the facts in the scenario that we gave them. And out of these people who chose guilty in the each element group, which is not true because only 2 of the 3 elements were meant to be satisfied, out of that, the 2 people that did choose this also believed that each of these elements was satisfied. So they did just misinterpret the instructions, and this is something that we took into account when revising the study to expand it to more participants and then also go into our follow-up studies, which we'll talk about a little later. And then we also have graph 1C here, which is how many people thought each element was satisfied in the control group. Here, 3 people thought that less than 3 elements were satisfied. So they thought that only 1 or 2 out of the 3 elements were satisfied, but they still chose to pick guilty, meaning that this each element does have an impact on which verdict someone is choosing. And then our figure 2 shows our answers to our alternative question, which, as Kayla mentioned, is asking them to consider the alternative instruction. So this chart specifically is for the each element group. So they did receive each element instructions. And then in question 4, they were asked to consider what they would pick if each element was not in their instructions. So as you can see here, 13 people who did choose not guilty decided that they would change their verdict to guilty if each element was not specified in these instructions. So this also aligns with our hypothesis that if given the option to take a more holistic approach rather than a checkbox approach to the elements of the crime, people are willing to do that, and more people will convict even though all 3 elements of the crime are not satisfied.
So that was just our pilot study. Now for our next steps, we're looking to finalize our surveys, which we've done, and then distribute them to a much larger group. So we just discussed the kidnapping pilot study. Using feedback from our respondents and also our attorney contact, we've finalized a version of the kidnapping study, which we are looking to distribute to 500 people through a crowdsourcing platform, where 250 will receive the each element of instructions and 250 will receive the control instructions. And in that scenario, it is, again, element 3 at issue, whether the child moved a substantial distance. And the answer is pretty ambiguous and vague. But we will also be testing 2 alternate variations of the kidnapping survey. So the first, which we call technicality, is another kidnapping scenario, but this time the answer to whether element 3 was satisfied, whether the child moved a substantial distance, is more clearly not satisfied. So in that variation, before the child moves anywhere, the defendant is apprehended. So therefore, if respondents are considering each of the elements, they should pretty easily be able to find the defendant not guilty. However, if they take a more holistic approach, as we suspect some in the control group will, they might still find the defendant guilty. Our final variation, which we call abstract, considers what would happen if we removed emotion from the question. So what would happen if we didn't run a kidnapping scenario? Is it possible that some people might just choose guilty because it is such an emotionally charged crime? So in abstract, we take away the facts and respondents will only receive a set of instructions. And the instructions will tell them that there is a crime with 3 elements, and the prosecution has only proven 2 of the 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And then they will be asked to select a verdict, and this will help us remove or be able to see any potential emotional bias that may have come from the kidnapping scenarios in the previous 2 surveys. So ultimately, we suspect that our 3 finalized surveys will reaffirm our pilot study data and confirm our hypotheses, and we believe that the words each element of are necessary to ensure that justice is served in California.
So before you sit down, can we invite
Yes, could everybody please get up on that stage?
everybody that gives payments?
Yes, of course.
And if you could group yourselves on either side of the screen, that's wonderful for our live stream
On the other
audience.
side, so that otherwise I think they can't see us.
There we go. That's great. The floor is open for questions.
I have one. I have
Why
one
don't
for
we
each
start
one
with
of you
you,
if I
Buckley?
can. So I'm going to start in backward order, if that's okay. The first one is related to the kidnapping. In this particular case, when you're looking at individuals on their own in a jury, you're actually having a discussion. And so this isolation actually changes the whole dynamic. And I was just curious as to, since you had an attorney who actually asked you to conduct this type of research, have you thought of maybe interviewing the actual jurors and then doing this with them and giving them an opportunity to see if the scenario had been different? Would that have affected their decision?
I think that in previous studies that the lab has done, we have worked with jurors, but this study was started during COVID, so it wasn't too possible to do that. So I think we took this more survey-based approach. And then actually the feedback from like real lawyers was really helpful here, because we were told that we can't make the case completely cut and dry, otherwise it wouldn't go to court at all. So that's why we added the technicality version, where it is very clear that that element, they're not moving at all. Whereas in our newer version of the kidnapping, the pilot study was a little different, but in our newer version of the kidnapping, after editing it, we have them move a little bit, so it's like ambiguous. So the definition of a substantial distance is a little bit more ambiguous, and it's more likely to go to court. So we tried to make it more realistic in that sense, but I think we are trying to consider like the individual linguistic processing of a juror rather than, I guess, the community juror deliberation.
It's very interesting because of the fact that it is so subjective, and also so determined based on location. So thank you for that. The question I have for group number 2, if I could go to you, is related specifically to race. You bring up the BlueBikes and the racial composition of usage, but there are a couple components of this that were of interest to me. One, bicycles cost money, but renting bikes also cost money. So do you have any knowledge or information about the amount of ownership of bikes by people in Boston by demographic data? And the second thing, because typically the other thing is, what was the purpose of a blue bike? Is it primarily focused on tourists or people who have short-term needs? So wouldn't that be more indicative of who's coming in and needing those bikes for transportation? And then the other part of this is an overlay of where blue bikes are located relative to the racial demographic composition of Boston. That would really assist you, because I would bet if these are really in tourist areas or areas where you have people who have temporary or short-term transportation needs, it's probably going to be not so much based on residential distribution, but perhaps on other types of utilization. So I would advocate that maybe thinking about those, or if you have an answer for those, that would be great too.
So for the last question in particular, we actually did analyze the location of the stations as a whole, and found no statistically significant bias towards or against race once population and density had been corrected for. So in terms of where the stations are and who the stations are meant to service, there is no statistically significant bias towards white areas. However, in terms of actual usage, we do see a strong statistically significant bias.
I think there's a little bit more data that you need to have in there to really be able to formulate, because the cost elements have to be incorporated in there as well. Because obviously people are using transportation regardless of what race they are, but it may be more indicative of who the people are they're using. That's just one question I just have. And then I'll go to Tabor if I can for the very last one and open it up. Tabor, when it comes to people who are on the wealthier end, you mentioned, and we've talked about this, so unfortunately I'm privy for this, but about people who on the wealthier end, maybe a cutoff in terms of access to water might be necessary. Why wouldn't a pricing mechanism be sufficient?
Tabor, you might want to walk closer to one of the mics just because you're on the far end. There you go.
Well, this is a small group of consumers we're concerned about, right? So but in terms of the highest users of residential water, right, it's people who own swimming pools and people who have giant lawns, right? And we can safely assume large swimming pools and large lawns are very correlated with income. So there's these wealthy people who are going to pay price increases, and there's other elements when you consider lawns, for example, right? There's a status and there's other ramifications and implications of not maintaining your lawn, especially, there's like homeowners associations and stuff like that, right? So there's benefits that, while they'd be hard to quantify, are going to be worth that price, or the alternative, right, like the consequences of not maintaining your lawn or draining your swimming pool, right? Those are still going to be worth that increase in price to these consumers who are of a high income bracket and a low price sensitivity.
So that's why you'd have to put a limit.
Right, you'd have to have a hard cap.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate the answers too. Please.
I also have questions for everyone, but I'm not going to ask questions of everyone because I want to leave room for other people, including you may ask questions of each other. So I think I also have a question for Tabor. I found all these papers fascinating in the angles that they took on their take on their projects. To me, they all start slightly downstream of somewhere. And the place, Tabor, that it seems to me your project starts downstream of is, this is because you're an economist, right? So economy is your, economics is your hammer, and so pricing is your nail. But I'm just, you're probably aware that there are a lot of frameworks that would approach the question of the value of water quite differently. And I thought it was, I think there's a sort of, not a pun, but a kind of ambiguity buried in that word value. You're thinking of, we want to affect perceptions of the economic value. There are many kinds of people who would argue, and I'm thinking, for example, of indigenous people who might be worried, right, about the loss of their water use, who would argue that that's the completely wrong understanding of what the value of water is, right? That the value of water is, or that water actually that we need to treat water differently, not price it differently, right? That we really need to conceive our understanding of our relationship to water. So I'm just wondering sort of how you see your tool in relation to those other ways of thinking about, or your framework in relation to those other kinds of, let's say, environmentalist or like eco, whatever ways of thinking about the value of water.
Yeah, so I would say ultimately my goals are sort of aligned with that same sentiment, right? Like our current relationship and understanding of natural resources has us on a downward path, right? And that's where we need to end up, but sort of economist term as well, but there's like a short-term and a long-term solution, right? So in the short run, we definitely we are in a system that values and appreciates market prices, right? Like we, as a society, we really trust market prices. And so to change people's understandings and attitudes, while it's necessary, it's definitely hard and that takes time. If we look at the historical component of my research too, it's like these are pretty baked in there, right? So by first recognizing a change in market price, I think people's attitudes and will begin to change, right? Like even if it's only at first numerically more valuable, it does become more valuable, which I think would have long run implications on people's, just understanding of it as a precious item, substance, etc.
Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask each of the teams real quick. I'm really impressed by each of your work, which is really grappling with equity in 3 different contexts. Does a public program provide for everyone like it's supposed to? Is water priced fairly? Are you convicted fairly or not? So you were working with the data that you were given, the data that you found, or what you were able to work with due to the constraints of COVID. Imagine that you've just received $1 million. What are you going to do? What are the issues, the limitations that you face that you'd be able to jump over? What would you do to study this? Yeah, you guys want to start?
I think we would try to see different demographics of people in different areas too, because a lot of what we were talking about in our research was when we were trying to find people who we want to survey, we didn't just want to find people at Northeastern because people have a baseline understanding of jury instructions and things like that. We wanted to find people who have different academic backgrounds, or even different we have a lot of linguistic majors in our research, and a lot of them talk about how different parts of even the US interpret things differently, or maybe interpret things differently. So I think definitely reaching out to a different group of people.
Yeah, I definitely think creating a representative population, because we allow this study to be taken by anyone who's jury qualified, so above 18, US citizen. But I think that the elements of who's actually in a jury are very different from who's easily accessible to us, because this pilot was run on friends and family, and we did look at some demographic analysis as well. And we had one of our members is a co-op at a big biotech place, so he asked his bosses to take the study, and obviously that's going to be a more analytical minded approach, and they use the checkbox method regardless of whether each element was present or not. So it really depends on how you're processing it, and I think the demographic constraint is something that I don't know if it could be overcome with $1 million, but hopefully it would be. We would find some way to do it.
I love that this was run on friends and family. It's very awkward conversations afterwards about this. That's really cool. How about BlueBikes team?
Probably, if I had $1 million, I would use it to incentivize people to have an individual interview. If we could find BlueBikes writers, I don't know, just stop them somehow, and use that $1 million to really make them want to sit down and talk with us. I think it'd be great to really hear personal stories about why they choose to ride a bike, where they're going, things like that.
Got it. And water. What do you think?
I would probably want to do some sort of household study. Another component of the issue is people, for the most part, don't understand the volume of water they use. There's been surveys done where it's how much water do you think you use a month? And in general, people underestimate it by a factor of 2, So I think just installing water meters that keep a running total would be interesting to sort of measure, what the impact of, we get a better sense of what the scope for the impact of pricing would be, right? Because if there's some automatic change of behavior once people have a better understanding of how much they're consuming, right, then you're sort of identifying what's left for pricing to work and if it is needed, etc. So.
May I make a comment to the jury group? There was one thing that just came in mind when you gave your answer. Since you have to be limited to individual responses, you could actually make a concluding comment with regard to why we have juries that are composed of more than one individual. Mm-hmm. Because the strong variation in interpretive license, even whether you have just the sample population or sample group that you had, what should I say, sample group, that doesn't make any sense, the sample that you started with, as opposed to this other one that you're creating now, you're still going to have the same issue because you're dealing with individual responses. But I do think that there is some validation with those individual responses from thinking about collective thinking that's missing.
I think in our lab discussions as well, we see this a lot because when trying to refine this so that people more seriously see that that element 3 is not satisfied, we have our own arguments, and sometimes we'll have a lab meeting of 2 hours where we're just arguing about like a one-word change, like what is substantial distance? Like we don't know ourselves, so it's very hard to develop something that everyone will interpret the same way. And that I agree with the idea of how collective juries can create a different interpretation than just individual ones.
And I know we have one more question to that. Did you have a question, Mary? And I think we have time for just one more question.
All right. For BlueBikes, I'm wondering, in addition to sort of the monetary obstacles, if lower income neighborhoods in Boston are isolated by unfriendly infrastructures of difficult streets and things like that, all sorts of physical obstacles that may make them islanded, in the land, and that the history of that, those things, those might be accessible to analysis even without another $1 million for individual incentives. Could be interesting.
And in comparison of this type of study in other cities like New York City, because there's also this type of bike there, I think it would be useful because
we actually did read in our preliminary literature review, there was a similar study done on a bike sharing program in, I think it was Shenzhen.
Maybe.
I think it was Shenzhen.
There's also something in like Chicago, I think. But, yeah.
Yeah. And they also essentially found like the infrastructure is very important, as much as they essentially found you can build as many stations as you want, you can supply as many bicycles as you want, but there still has to be the government support for funding, for subsidies, for accessibility, for infrastructure.
when I'm thinking about Manhattan, that's to me the only real city. That here, and you compare it to a Boston, Manhattan is set up for anybody to ride, and you have a demographic distribution. That would be, I think, a really nice comparison to just look at for Boston. I think you might start to see a little more patterns.
And now it only remains for us to thank our moderators, our presenters, and everyone who has supported this event. So thank you for concluding our 8th annual Undergraduate Research Forum and sharing your work with us. And thank you all.